want to start off by thanking so much the Hibiscus organization for having me today. I want to thank you for the work that you do with the elderly, and particularly the work that you do with Black, British, and Caribbean elderly in London. So I just want to start off by thanking you for doing that. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about my work and to talk about the work of the women in my family, and to talk about the work that I saw other Jamaican women outside of my family doing. I'm Jacqueline Bishop. I am a writer, a visual artist, and a scholar. I'm completing my PhD in History of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Leeds. And I teach full-time at New York University in New York. So I want to start off first talking about John Canoe. This is a talk that will seek to trace the African traditions, sub-Saharan African traditions in Jamaican textile traditions. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is John Canoe, which is a street performance involving music and dance and having masked costume performers. The performance has been associated with Jamaica from the arrival of the enslaved to the island. Both Sir Hans Sloane, which I think you guys know very well, I think you guys know very well in the UK, and Edward Long recorded performances of John Canoe in the 17th century, and they observed that the enslaved would, quote unquote, would occasionally add such things to make their bodies in several places very extraordinary in appearance. In the period of slavery and through colonialism, the performance took place on the few days that the enslaved were released from work, Boxing Day, December 26th, and on New Year's Day, January 1st. The formerly enslaved would adopt John Canoe as a marker of identity, and John Canoe performances and their African textile traditions started becoming icons of African and Jamaican nationalism and ways to identify yourself as Jamaican on the island and African. Now, John Canoe performances are performed throughout the diaspora. Jamaica is not the only place. I am talking about Jamaica today, but it's not unique to Jamaica. Although John Canoe can be performed by a single character, there are often several characters which make up the performance, each distinctive for the way in which they present in dress and appearance. And I think that's very important to stop there for a moment and talk. There are going to be images as well that you will see, but what makes them so distinctive is the way in which they dress and they present. The main character, John Canoe, carries a house on his head, while other important characters include a man in drag with a huge belly indicative of advanced stages of pregnancy, called Belly Woman, and Pitchy Patchy wearing torn and tattered clothing in a plethora of colors and layers. I want to stop there because I'm going to spend a lot of time on Pitchy Patchy. He wears what appears to be torn clothing in all sorts of colors. And we're going to see this. This is going to be a continuing theme throughout the talk today. Pitchy Patchy's face is obscured, and the figure's job is to crack a whip, keeping the surrounding crowd in order, which is quite common to West African sub-Saharan masquerade practices and traditions. The focus of the performance is on characters who go from place to place seeking patronage. You should give them some money, you should give them some things. And as you'll see, this continues from the period of slavery until today. Today, there are fewer street performances taking place at Christmas time of John Canoe, which is now performed throughout the year at various state functions and has become an important part of Independence Day celebrations, national festival competitions, and troops of performers have even been sent to represent the island abroad. Performers now enjoy both private and public sponsorship, where participants are often prepaid, right? Those are that. Now I'm going to spend some time on the character of Pitchy Patchy. He has oftentimes been argued as a syncretized British and Caribbean figure, but I don't believe that is who John Canoe is. This is from my research in doing my dissertation. I am not so convinced at all that this is who John Canoe is. I think the figure more demonstrates sub-Saharan textile traditions. One of the things to focus on about Pitchy Patchy are the striated bits of color that compromises his costume and the masking of the figure's face. No two Pitchy Patchy costumes are ever the same or alike, since these costumes are improvisational, spontaneous, and intuitive. But there is a general focus on contrast rather than blends in the colors used in the costume, all of which is going to become quite important. Pitchy Patchy engages in egungun, I'm certainly not saying that right, I'm sure, masking practices where he can look out at observers, but observers can never quite see his face. The figure's torn, disheveled manner is evidence of all that he has endured during the Middle Passage and the period of enslavement. Indeed, oral history interviews Sheila Barnett collected details Pitchy Patchy's clothing being scraps from the master's clothing, linking Pitchy Patchy to slavery and sub-Saharan Africa. From this point of view, from my point of view, too much emphasis has been placed as reading the figure as creolized and missing instead sub-Saharan aesthetics. Now, I just want to stop there for a moment and talk. I'm a much better person when I'm talking than when I'm reading. And John Canoe is a festival where men participate in the festival. Men dress up as even female characters. And but if we look on the state level, John Canoe is being recouped by the state as a part of Jamaican identity and whatnot. But if we look at the work that artists are doing, the figures begin to transform in fantastic ways, right? And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit right now. A fleeting quote unquote carnival repost posted to Facebook on April 30th, 2019 by Akeem Kerr indicates the ways that Pitchy Patchy in particular, but John Canoe in general, can never be fully state controlled. In the performance, a male figure whose face is masked in a black cloth and who is wearing a headband holding long green stalks of grass like a feathered crown bursts from the side of the house. In his arm, the performer carries a Jamaican flag, which he waves as he dances to a calypso song called Follow the Leader. Long green grass, like strips of cloth, sticks out from the pockets of the knee-length shorts, which have been cut in strips, mimicking the long strips of cloth in Pitchy Patchy's clothing. Long green grass has also been taped onto the performer's ankles as well. The tune of the song tells the role of the figure as being that of a guide whose job it is to crack his whip and keep the crowd in order. The long stacks of grass reference floral, garden, and sublimated African aesthetics. The notes added to the video indicates that this Pitchy Patchy is being used as an icon of Jamaican culture, in contradiction to that of the European-based carnival traditions that are gaining popularity in Jamaica as the John Canoe street culture diminishes. This lone figure demonstrates the fugitive and changing nature of John Canoe practice on the island, which has become more decentralized. The character has left his troupe behind. Yet, what this fleeting fugitive performance shows is that John Canoe And John Canoe related textile practices remain an important aspect of African Jamaican identity and cannot be fully contained by state intervention or patronage. In other words, what I am seeing is that even as the state recoups John Canoe and its sub-Saharan and West African tradition aesthetics, and so John Canoe would perform for various state functions, it can never fully be controlled because you have actors like this Akeem Kerr and other people on TikTok and whatnot who engage in John Canoe performances as well. Now I'm going to turn to the work of Saint Mae Dunkley. Perhaps it's best if I just talk through the rest of the performance because it's hard to be looking down and whatnot. So I'll just glance at my notes and talk a little bit. Now, Saint Mae Dunkley, many of the elements of Pitchy Patchy can be found in the work of Saint Mae Dunkley, a gifted mat maker who unfortunately, so unfortunate, we lost her about 4 or 5 years ago. So sad, right? Because we lost her right at the moment when she was gaining international recognition and attention. She was actually scheduled to be at the be in New York when she died to talk about her work, and she never made it. You know, it's sad, right? When we look at the work of someone like Saint Mae Dunkley, we see the narrow strips of cloth that is used in Pitchy Patchy as well. She uses, which is a sub-Saharan aesthetic, she uses that to full effect and impact in her work. Dunkley also engages in using her work to give us a sense of Jamaican nationalism. So she had works that were in the colors of the Jamaican flag, for example, that's yellow, green, and black. And she also had work that are in Rastafarian colors, red, yellow, and green, right? So she's engaging with nationalism. How she worked, Saint Mae Dunkley, of course, as you can see, I'm quite fluent in Saint Mae Dunkley. I knew her for many years and feel confident in talking about her. Is how she worked was that she would get an image in her mind, right? And then she would try to realize that image in cloth, right? So, for example, one of her most fantastic works, which was like about 60 by 70 huge things, I think you're going to see that image, was called the Garden of Hope. And that's such a play, you know, on several things in Jamaican society all at once. So she said what was happening was that she was watching a television program on Hope Botanical Gardens, which is a royal botanic garden in Kingston. And she was looking at all the flowers that were in the botanical garden. And she decided to recreate these flowers in the Garden of Hope. So on the one hand, it's a play on the name of the garden, Hope Botanical Garden, but it's also a play on hopefulness, right? And the thing about Saint Mae Dunkley work is that it is linked to sub-Saharan Africa in very particular and specific ways, right? So one way is, of course, once you look at her work and look at something like Pitchy Patchy, it's very clear the aesthetic that she's working with. However, she also told me a fantastic tale that I have since through the process of doing my PhD, realized the resonances of what she was saying. She told me this story when I was talking to her. I should get a wonderful picture of her. I have one that I should send to you, in which I was asking her, I was like, well, saying, how did you learn to do this wonderful work? And she said, I learned it from the men in my family. I thought she was joking. I thought this was a joke, right? And she went on to tell me that it was the men in her family who did all the embroidery, who did all the mat work, who did the needlework, you know. And at first I thought, I can't quite understand what is going on here, but it is now, as I'm deep in my PhD process, that I realized what was going on is that men in sub-Saharan Africa are the prestige weavers, right? They are the one that that weave and make these prestige garments. And so that tradition of men being the weavers had carried on in her family and links her very specifically to sub-Saharan Africa. Now we are on to the patchworks of Nonsuch, right? And I can spend endless amount of time talking to you about the patchworks of Nonsuch because this comes out of my family, right? In fact, it's these patchworks that play a very important role in having me go for a PhD in the first place, right? So my great-grandmother, Celeste Walker, she was born in the early 1900s, right? And died somewhere in the 1980s, late 1980s, right? And I realize now what a privilege it is to have grown up with a grandmother and a great-grandmother, great-grandparents, actually. And since this is an institution which the audience are older folks, I want to give a shout out to the traditions that older folks can pass on to younger generations. Because as you will see in the rest of this talk, my great-grandmother and my grandmother had an indelible influence on me, right? And one of the things I'd be curious to hear from people in the, as we give this presentation, is if they recognize any of these traditions and can speak to it. So my great-grandmother was a fantastic patchworker, right? And the difference between patchwork and quilt, because oftentimes people get confused by the two, is that the patchwork does not necessarily have a backing, right? So the word quilts come from the padded backing that goes onto these objects. And this was done a lot in the American South because it was cold and there was a need to be warm, bring warmth as well, which was not so much of a concern in the Caribbean, where the focus was much more on the aesthetics. Some of my great-grandmother's patchworks and my grandmother's and my great-aunt's work have been transformed into quilts, but that's through my intervention as a visual artist. And also the need to safeguard and protect their work. They needed to be stabilized, right? My great-grandmother, Celeste, and also my grandmother, used patchwork as a form of memory and memorialization. And in so doing, they were really pulling on sub-Saharan textile traditions as well. So let me stop for a moment and explain to you what I mean by that. Jamaica and the larger Caribbean, as we know, have been, especially the British Caribbean, have had a relationship to Britain and the UK that goes back hundreds of years. And my great grandmother had daughters and various family members who went to the UK to study and to work and to live. And one of the ways in which my great-grandmother would memorialize these individuals is in giving them specific colors. And she would use those colors in her patchwork in talking, in giving presence to those who were not around her at the time. Unfortunately, I do not know what those colors are now. We've unfortunately lost that. But she had a whole aesthetic that she worked out in her mind that went into these colors and all of the things that she was trying to say, memorialize, and all the discussions she was trying to have with people who were and who were not around her. My great-grandmother participated very heavily and strongly in Afro-Caribbean religious traditions. She was very much influenced by that. And if you look at the rhythmic ways, she uses patterns and the vibrancy and the spontaneity in her work, you can see strong connections to even Pitchy Patchy. So we're back there again, right? My great-grandmother's patchworks were for special occasions, Christmas, Easter, and these were the patchworks that she would put on her bed when people came over. These were not for everyday use. These patchworks were part of my great-grandmother's legacy for those who had eyes to see what she was doing, that she was bequeathing to generations to come. So that's my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and her patchworks. Now, the last part of my talk, because I know folks do not want to sit here and listen to a talk forever, is about my own work as a visual artist and how I am pulling on the traditions that my family pulled on and the women in Jamaica pulled on, which I hope I've established by now are largely sub-Saharan African traditions, even though it might not look that way at first in my work. I use the patchwork aesthetic a lot in my work, and I use collage a lot. So if you look at the two images that I have, they are collaged together, which is, of course, the aesthetic that I've been talking about as well, but also the use of these bright colors and a sense of spontaneity, which I'm linking to sub-Saharan traditions. I want to end by noting that in trying to, one of the things I've struggled with so much as a writer and a visual artist is trying to find my place. You know, what is your place, Jacqueline? And I have people a lot trying to put me in my place, right? What they think my place is supposed to be. And so by the time I went to graduate school, I went to graduate school a lot, actually. You could make a case that I went to graduate school too much, right? In trying to find my place with degrees in visual art and creative writing. But my first degree was in psychology. And because my mother was very supportive of anything that I did. But I think when I was growing up as a little girl in Jamaica, there was not a sense of what exactly do you do with the visual art? How do you get paid? It's not being like a lawyer or a doctor or something that people felt were quite tangible. So the question was always, how do you get paid? So as supportive as my mother was, that was always something that stood up, was working itself out at the back of my mind. What can poetry do? What can literature do? What can the visual arts do? And so I ended up taking all these classes. I was going to become a medical doctor. I wasn't very good in the sciences. I kept taking them and failing all over the place. But that was what was held up and validated. And I got a first degree in psychology. So by the time I realized that what I really am is a writer, a visual artist, and a scholar, I did not have that undergraduate footing in in the visual arts, or with a degree in the visual arts or creative writing. So while you could make a case that I was talented enough to get into very good creative writing and art, visual art programs, I did not have the background that most of the folks there had. Consequently, one of the questions that would always arise, especially in the visual arts, is who are you in conversation with, right? And people would reel off these artists that they were in conversation with. And I was like, right? And it took me a very, very long time to realize that who I was in conversation with was my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, saying Mae Dunkley, and these women who were working in this vernacular textile tradition. And even when my work is photography or painting, it's still a discussion with these women because it still has at its root something related to sub-Saharan textile traditions. I want to thank you for this opportunity to address you. I hope you have a wonderful time. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Jacqueline Bishop.